Thank you very much, Michael. I'm extremely honored and moved to be up here rather than sitting there. Let me know if this microphone is not picking up my voice properly. I tend to have a pretty soft voice. I had this up on the screen so that you could read it on your own. I'm not going to read them out loud. Obviously, I put them up together because I felt that there was an interesting resonance among the three statements, even despite the distance that separates them. The last is probably the most unfamiliar figure. Quatremer de Quincy, he was a nobleman and a scholar, and he wrote those words, as I say, in June, July 1796 from an undisclosed location, as he had been condemned to death by the criminal tribunal of the French Revolutionary regime. He was later acquitted after publishing these letters on the damage that would be caused to the arts and sciences by the displacement of the monuments of art of Italy, from the dismembering of its schools of art, and from the spoliation of its collections, galleries, and museums, etc. These letters of 1796 were read by everyone who mattered at the time in France, and they provoked a lively debate then, maybe they will continue to, over the function of the museum and the nature of art, only 3 years after the Musée Central des Arts, the Museum of the Louvre, the first modern museum, was founded in 1793. So they are written at the inception of the museum as an institution, and they anticipate quite wonderfully, as I hope to show you, all later museum critique. Quatremer wrote these letters just as it was becoming clear that the French campaign in Italy, a military campaign commanded by General Napoleon, was going to be accompanied by a cultural dimension, the systematic appropriation of exemplary works of art in all media and from all periods and from all the major Italian capitals. Art experts and artists were recruited in this cultural military campaign, consulting on which works to take. To tear works of art out of their original settings, Quatremer argued, was to cut them off from their sources of meaning. The museum that will be formed elsewhere from these dismemberments will not have the whole ensemble and the foundation that would give these fragments their true value. In order to understand art, Quatremer argued, in order for art to have the beneficial effect it's meant to have, one had to experience it within its original ensemble, what we would now perhaps call its context. Ensemble had several layers for Quatremer. It began in the widest sense with the land, the actual virtues of the place in some basic sense in which the art was made. But it also meant the institutions for which and in which the art was made, temple, church, whatever political organization it might be. And another kind of context for him, or ensemble, was the ensemble of other works of art made in that place and time. Now, all of this will sound very familiar to contemporary historians of art and people interested in art history. Especially in the last few decades, art historians have been very interested in trying to understand works of art in situ. They talk about contingent points of view rather than the face-on museological point of view. They talk about sightlines, processional pathways. They talk about the institutional programming at various levels that went into works of art, as well as, in a more general sense, the ideological stakes. And I think that's that development, which is really primarily 70s, 80s, 90s development in our history, is one among many fairly clear examples of art historians learning from the artists who, since minimalism, site-specific sculpture, institution critique, have been insisting on just these issues in their work. But way before all of this, there was Quatremer saying it in 1796. When a work of art is torn from its context, its ensemble, he argued, not only is the original ensemble left mangled, but the work itself in its new museum location falls silent, loses meaning, can no longer deliver what it has to deliver. You could see Robert Smithson's non-site as a kind of diagnosis of this problem and an artistic response to it. For Quatremer, as for any number of what we used to, I hope it's in the past, call modernist and postmodernist artists, it is not just a question of moving one thing from one place to another. It is that movement, that portability, is bound up with art's association with commerce. Not that works of art had never been bought or sold before, but now they seem to be moving at something like the rate of commercial productions, and mingled with them, acquired something of their status. Do you believe, he said, that a nation that acquires a few pieces of beauty, like so many boxes of merchandise, will really be benefited by this importation? Now, I realize this is a crude comparison or juxtaposition. There are many dots to fill in here. There's a difference between works of art caught up in commerce and works of art that make that process part of their theme. And of course, one could show any number of works of art that belong to this story, complicated episodes in the story, gender dimensions, for instance. I suppose the successor to Olympia today would be Andrea Fraser in her otherwise untitled self-prostitution piece, where she eliminates all distinctions between artwork, artist, and commercial transaction. In the early 20th century, maybe one would want to look at Kurt Schwitters in his efforts to save art through his new concept of März, the cast-off of Commerz. But each of those is a lecture unto itself, so let me move on to the next interesting quote from Quatremer. Until when are we going to look upon the objects of public instruction, and by that he means works of art, as if they were jewels, as if they were diamonds that can only be enjoyed according to their market value? Can he resist showing the next slide? I continue with Quatremer. Is it for the pleasure or only for the stupid reward of having what others do not that one should desire that possession? Now, again, I know this is crude, but isn't that part of the point? This is more complicated than just things being bought and sold, works of art being bought and sold like other commercial products. The Hearst piece takes the art market very much as its theme, and in fact it sold for more than the market value of its diamonds and platinum. But of course that only serves to prove that art on its own has its own market value. You could complicate it further. You could say, well, in fact, it sold at the price that it sold at, a clean 100 million, because that was an engineered effect. The sale was rigged by a consortium to which the artist probably belonged, etc. Nonetheless, I think we can give Quatremer pretty high points for another good prediction. It's a new religion, Quatremer says. It's even like the relic cult. Pieces by Raphael are frantically collected and displayed in galleries and museums, quote, more or less as in former times when every church wanted a piece of the true cross. I'm not going to show a piece of the true cross. Instead, I'll show a head of a saint, because it's local, and because I think it actually makes a good comparison to the piece on the left. People say the Hearst piece is invoking the tradition of the vanitas. That's never made sense to me. A skull may be a vanitas, but skull with diamonds? I don't see that. It's more to me like a relic in its reliquary. The gold, silver, and gems are there to signal, on the right, of course, to signal that something of zero material worth has incalculable sacred value. The treasures of the world, as it were, spontaneously accrue to it. But, Quatremer continues, the modern art cult is a perverse adaptation of the former relic cult. The relic cult, he explains, rightly, operated according to a synecdochic logic. That is, a piece of the holy relic carried the virtue of the whole. But a whole artistic school, he says, cannot be expressed by each detached bit of the school. In fact, he says, one learns the secret of a school of painting not from its masterpieces, but only in the large series, from seeing the whole array of productions of any given place or time. And that's a pretty advanced notion, the critique of the canon, or at least this larger view. Nonetheless, Quatremer is very much caught up in the logic that he is protesting. He laments the dispersion of the works of Raphael, but his solution to that problem is itself a very modern one. He wants to, at one point in the text, he says, wouldn't it be nice to reunite all the works of the Raphael school in Rome? That's obviously an artificial and even ahistorical enterprise. Raphael lived in Urbino, Florence, Perugia, before he went to Rome. What he is proposing here is nothing other than a blockbuster Raphael exhibition, like the kind we saw in the Raphael quincentennial year of 1984. And what Raphael was to them, circa 1800, it seems Caravaggio, the rebel, is to us. He seems to get a major exhibition pretty much every year. But this sort of thing was unheard of in 1796, once again proving that Quatremer was speaking with prophetic inspiration. Of course, in other ways, Quatremer is very much responding to his time and to what we would call, I guess, an incipient museum culture. His very notion of context, of the ensemble, of the unity and integrity of the original composite of ancient Rome is actually just as abstract an idea, just as modern idea as that of admiring a work of art in aesthetic isolation. He protests the effects of déplacement because Rome had already become, in his own words, a véritable muséum. So art history had already begun in the 18th century to do its work of creating virtual unities out of fragments, and he gives credit for this to the great 18th century art historian Johann Joachim Winckelmann, who had begun putting a systematic picture of ancient art together. Winckelmann was able, in Quatremer's words, to décomposer l'Antiquité, that is, to analyze the times, the peoples, the schools, the styles, the nuances of style, and then to move from analysis to synthesis, to make a body out of what had been, until then, only a mass of debris. Unfortunately, Quatremer laments he had only accomplished 1/100th of what needs to be done, and now the pieces are being dislocated and dispersed in museums before the scientific project could be completed. And yet it's clear enough that the one bad development, déplacement, is not so much in contradiction to the other good development, creating art historical unities out of the past. Rather, they're part of the same logic. Once Rome starts to be seen as a véritable muséum, a museum of itself, if you will, it's only a matter of time before the real logic of museology takes over and affects its disintegrating work of déplacement. Even the artists, he says, participate in the process, helping to select and transport the works, not realizing, he insists, that they are contributing to the destruction of the arts and thus to the end of their own art. All we are left with in Quatremer's clear-eyed analysis is art under capitalism. He actually cites Adam Smith at one point. He knows very well what capitalism is. In his terms, art is being taken up into an economy of speculation. Now, this is an anti-capitalist critique from the right, but it anticipates with astonishing lucidity points later made by modernist, Marxist critics. Works of art have become deracinated and set adrift on the market. The cultural destruction this brings empties out the entire cultural artistic enterprise that drives the very interest in art and culture. You see, he sees it as a kind of self-undermining logic. So everyone is speculating on art, but it is speculation feeding on itself because art no longer has integrity or purpose in such a system. Does any of this sound familiar? Quatremer envisions, in fact, market bubbles and inevitably a great recession of art. Quote, "I ask of speculators in the political economy, who is being served by your artists who are fed by this foreign commerce in portable works of art? What benefit will you derive from this exclusive privilege of a commerce without outlet and of productions without consumers?" So, fairly dramatic points being made. If you listen to our guide of 1796, you really don't have to wait until Dada or the 60s to hear the call for the end of art to be sounded. He's calling it right here in year 4 of the revolution. And that is why this text is so destabilizing, as many prophecies are. If we listen to him, really our historical schemas collapse. We don't have the usual sequence anymore. I think if we really listen to him carefully, we don't have an era of art followed by the dismantling of art at the hands of certain 20th century avant-gardes. The era of art is nothing other than a series of reflections on the dismantling of art. And we no longer need to worry about tearing down the museum as we used to in the 80s. That's ridiculous. The museum is, from the beginning, a fairly hallucinatory work of installation art. In the era of speculation, that is the way art works. It moves, it gets recontextualized. Artists become quasi-curators, either manipulating earlier styles or physically setting materials authored by them or not into new ensembles. Now, we can argue whether this mobilization, this new mobility of art was really a new development in Quatremer's time as he felt it. But that might be worthy of discussion later. He definitely thought it was a development of his century, and he wasn't very happy about his century, as I imagine you've gathered. He once called his century a generation of pygmies. Luckily, some pygmies are very good at surfing the crashing wave. So let's move from text to art, and from this critical moment in the 1790s to an earlier moment at 1720. In the summer of that year, 1720, I would love some water. I don't know if it's here already.
Right on the shelf in front of you.
Is there a shelf in front of me?
In the podium, there should be 2 glasses there.
Oh, here, okay, thank you. Before we move into the art part, I thought I could have a drink. In the summer of the year 1720, the 37-year-old Antoine Vateau returned to Paris from London. He was sick of a lung illness that would kill him within months. And he was hosted by his friend, the art dealer Edme François Gersaint, in his home. And Gersaint, in one of his many very loquacious catalogues from later in the century, described the episode in 1744, 24 years later. On his return to Paris, when my business was still in its early stages, Vateau came and asked me if I would receive him and allow him, in order to keep his fingers supple, those were his very words, if I would allow him, as I was saying, to paint a sign to be exhibited outside the shop, so outside the shop where he deals in the paintings. I was not in favor of the idea because I would have preferred him to work on something more substantial. But seeing that it would give him pleasure, I consented. The success of the picture is well known. It was done from life. The attitudes were so varied and so graceful. This is still Gersaint. The composition was so natural and the groups so well thought out that it attracted the attentions of passers-by in front of the store. Even highly skilled painters came several times to admire it. It was done in 8 days. Painters in the room can tell me what they feel about that. And even then, he only worked in the mornings. His delicate health, or to be more accurate, his weakness, prevented him from working on it longer. This was the only work in which he ever took the slightest pride. He told me this quite frankly. C'est le seul ouvrage qui est un peu aiguisé son amour-propre. Il ne fit point de me l'avouer. He died shortly after painting it. It was quickly taken inside, so from being a sign outside to being a work for sale, I suppose, inside. But it began its life as a signboard, and it was placed above the entryway to Gersaint's shop, which was on the Pont Notre-Dame. Apparently it spent 15 days, all of 15 days outside, so a very short temporary exhibition, but enough to attract buzzing attention if we are to believe him. Once it came inside, it passed to two pretty well-placed persons in succession, close to the artist. And then it was acquired around mid-century in the late 1740s by Frederick the Great of Prussia, one of the great collectors of the time, and that's why it's in Berlin now. So it starts as a signboard, it enters private collections, and then it enters a princely collection. And what I want to say about it is essentially that the view from the outside is not simply a question of the scene's staging and composition. It is very much part of the whole conception of the work. It takes a position at the edge of an art system and looks at it. So the painting stood outside in both the physical and the structural sense. Now, I don't know how much people here know about signboard painting, but it's an interesting history about which we do not know enough. Every street in Paris was filled with them. There were no number addresses in Paris. You found out about places by hearing the name of the shop and then looking for the signboard that in one way or another emblematized the name of the shop. There are a few signboards left in places like the Musée Carnavalet in Paris, but they tend to be of later periods, right? So this is a sign from the Chat Noir in Montmartre from 1881, and then another sign for a barbershop, also, I would say, late 19th century. In the 18th century, they generally came in two forms. There was the enseigne, which was flat to the building, and, or rather, no, the enseigne was perpendicular, as these clearly were meant to be. And there was the plafond, which was flat to the building. generally, the reformers, the lawmakers, kept trying to enforce laws moving the signs from enseigne, which were extremely dangerous, to plafond. There are all kinds of great period documents. The 18th century is enviable for anyone who studies other fields because it was so loquacious about itself. And there are any number of documents that talk about the racket these signs made in the wind and, you know, the dangers of them. So it's a constant battle between lawmakers who are trying to restrict the size of them and the form of them, and shopkeepers who wanted to advertise their shops in the best possible way. So this history is very interesting in itself. I'm hardly an expert in it, but I think it's interesting from the point of view of the Vateau, primarily because when you consider the entire system of painting in this period, the signboards play an important role. They are the subaltern form of painting in this period. To call a painting a shop sign is basically to say it's a bad painting. And there was a lot writing on these distinctions because, in fact, when it came to the actual institutions that organized the arts, all the painters were put together, right? Whether they're house painters or sign painters or decorators, painters with high artistic ambitions, they all belonged equally to the maîtrise des peintres, sculpteurs, doreurs et vitriers, so gilders, glass makers, all in the same category. Yes, the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture was founded in 1648 precisely to kind of effect a division between high painting and all of this other stuff, and sculpture. But that did not change things overnight at all. Vateau reputedly began his career humbly and as a sign painter, and then rose from these origins in unconventional ways. He really was friends with dealers his entire life. He doesn't seem to have worked on commission very much. And he rose in that way to prominence as one of the great painters of his time. Only to return at the end of his life to signboard painting. But obviously this is no simple return to humble origins. It's a kind of spiral back, but at a different level. The signboard clearly offered him a position from which to offer a kind of commentary about a new system of painting emerging in this time. So it's lower as a signboard, but it's higher as a meta-painting. So that strategy, I would say, to go low in order to go somewhere else is, of course, something we find all the way through modern art. There are paradoxes about this. It was the most commercial of painting categories, made in untold numbers by hack painters, advertising commercial enterprises. But this one was prompted by no commission and was offered as a gift. So it kind of undermines its category in at least that way. It's the most site-specific of works, and yet its subject is a new mobility of art and the remobilization of old art. So it's definitely a meta-painting, but I feel like it's so easy to see it that way that it's important to insist that it was a signboard. It was site-specific. It's a very, very wide painting, and that's because of the place for which it was made. In fact, it was wider originally. It wasn't rectangular either. So I'm just going to go through some, I guess, technical history to give you a sense of the site specificity of this work, conditions under which it was made. This shadow here is the sort of thing that I'll be concentrating on, as well as that. The wonderful Hubert Robert made paintings that are often useful in moments like this. This is his painting of the demolition of the same bridge on which Gersaint's shop had stood decades before. And I'm going to zoom in on this area. I'm not saying that's the shop. There are people who actually know these things. I'm not one of them. But you can see it's a very regular kind of formation on this bridge. That's the space in which the painting was meant to go. And it originally had that shape. So it was actually a plafond, but it sounds less good to say the plafond of Gersaint. I'll keep with enseigne de Gersaint. Okay, so here's the hole, and you can see that it's been remanaged. So the change in status from signboard to picture in collection wasn't just a virtual change in status, it was a physical one. It involved physical changes. And we can see them really clearly on X-rays. So that's just a reminder below about the space that it was meant to go in. And you can see very clearly that pieces of canvas were added here in these, as it were, spandrels. You can also see that it had to have been wider than what we see now, and actually more was cut off on the right than on the left. Is that clear to everyone? Now, the fascinating thing is, why use new material when there's material right to hand? Look at that and that. And imagine taking those top pieces and attaching them to the sides, because that's where they were originally. Here's a different X-ray, and you can see very clearly, right? There's this bit, which corresponds to that, and then you see that. That was a continuation of this along the side. Does this make sense? But those pieces aren't all that was cut off. More than that was cut off. If you attach this one to this side, it actually works pretty well. But if you attach this piece to this side, there's a gap. So one strip was just lost. That's the way they turned it from a very awkwardly sized, extremely oblong painting into something that looked more like a gallery picture. It's now 3 meters 6 centimeters wide. It was originally 3 meters 55. As wide as the store. Apparently he painted it in the store, so that's why it was painted in two pieces. In other words, this is original, the two-panel structure. Okay. And then back, I think now with all of that, you can kind of do your own X-ray vision of the painting. Other changes occurred as well. This was originally not there. It was a kind of cart that was placed there, clearly a cart that was going to carry this away. I'll get back to that in a moment. Now, the signboards on this bridge of Notre Dame, other ones were named Au Chapeau Royal, Au Roi d'Angleterre, Au Lion d'Argent, Au Papillon, and you could imagine what these signboards might have looked like, right? They would have shown these things. One was very playful in its wordplay, Au Signe de Croix, Signe, S-Y-G-N-E, swan of the cross, the sign of the cross, the swan of the cross. So probably there was some funny emblem for that. And Gersaint's shop was called Au Grand Monarque, at the great monarch, which of course is Louis XIV, and there he is. So the signboard is doing what all signboards need to do, which is, afficher le titre, demonstrate pictorially what the shop's name is. And here is its model. That I upended it. It's been upended, but I'm upending it back in order to make the comparison to its model, the official portrait, late portrait of Louis XIV by Hyacinthe Rigaud, 1701. But normally, I think one would expect, if one were to invoke the portrait of the king at all, it would be upright in the enseigne. So this is one of the ways in which it's oblique in its relationship to its genre. There's a bit of irony here, maybe. Maybe it's a reference to the fact that Louis XIV died in 1715, just 3 years before Gersaint opened his shop in 1718. Maybe it's a reference to the fact that This painting is really about a shift in the conditions by which art is made and distributed. The great patrons of art are no longer, arguably, the king and the state. The arbiters of taste are no longer necessarily the noblemen, but wealthy and educated men, financiers such as Pierre Crozat, publishers like Pierre-Jean Mariette. Nobility was less a question of estate at this point than a matter of class. It was possible, increasingly, to acquire elevated status by being a cultivated person, by having what we would now call cultural capital. And Gersaint himself, in his wordy catalogues, talks about this very process. He talks about how someone who's knowledgeable in art can rise through the ranks of society. And he calls a connoisseur a curieux, someone who's curious. What advantages, he says, can a curieux customarily derive from his curiosity? His title of curieux gives him access to the most famous collections, and he can go to divert himself there. In the capacity of curieux, he becomes equal to those same people given over to this noble passion whose rank or condition is beyond his. As such, he is invited to and received with pleasure at their gatherings, etc., etc. One of the people who owned the Vateau enseigne painting, sorry, let me go back to the complete one, his friend Jean de Julien, who was a manufacturer of high-end textiles and also an important art collector, was ennobled officially in 1736 at the time that he owned this painting, and in part because of his many achievements in the cultural sphere. So this is a very real development, and it's both the context for this painting and, in a way, the subject of the painting. The old works of art made under the now somewhat antiquated system of sacred royal patronage were formally attached to their institutions, ecclesiastical, political institutions. Maybe they belonged to dynastic collections, but now they've started to move. And what is new is not simply that they become available for purchase by a rising bourgeoisie, but rather that the whole field is shifting. Aristocrats are in on this emerging art market and art culture. They are in the same field. They speak the language of the connoisseur, or what Gersaint calls the curieux. And the new playing field is really this shop where pictures are bought and sold and where expertise is tested. And we see the real effects of this, right? They're very sort of hard to discern, unquantifiable effects, but we see some real effects in the picture. The Louis XIV Portrait, it's an emblem of royalty. It was, in its original state, when it was made, one imagines, a quasi-magical surrogate of royal majesty standing in for him in a very powerful sense in halls of state, royal institutions, sometimes in important homes. But here, it's merchandise. It's being moved. It's a surface, it's an object, it's a painting for sale. Possibly it's seen as an example of French painting of an earlier era. An excellent example of the painting of Rigaud, maybe. It's been sold. It's being crated up. It's being readied for dispatch to its new owner. Maybe the fellow on the left there, and remember there would have been a cart in front, is the one who's waiting to take it away. Now, what paintings do we see here? This is obviously catnip to Curieux, the painting itself. One wants to know, okay, what's he showing? And needless to say, the art historians have done their best. But I think what's interesting about it is, A, he's showing old painting. So he's showing old painting undergoing a transformation in status. And B, none of these paintings are quotations, like actual citations of works of art. They are pastiche. Pastiche, not in the sense of putting a lot of different things together, but in the Proust sense, when Proust does a Balzac story. They are riffs on known styles, either regional styles or actual individual artists' styles. So one can have fun sort of thinking about whether Rubens really is the reference for this Venus and Cupid, or is it a charity? Who really is being invoked here in this oval? It's pre-Boucher days, right? Boucher is Vateau's student. It looks like a Boucher, but it's pre-Boucher days. Maybe Antoine Vateau would be kind of the artist pointed to here. I've always wondered who this Saint Bruno is really referring to. Up here, it looks like a Bassano, Adoration of the Shepherds. Here is a Silenus, looking either like Rubens or Jordaens. Here is, that's an interesting layering of citations, you might say, or of resonances. It looks a bit Coleridgesque, but maybe like Van Dyck in a Coleridgesque mode. This looks a bit like Rosa at this strange angle, or is it really more Ruysdael? So that's the kind of fun one can have with the painting. Now, if we look up here, we do find an actual citation that is clearly referring to an existing work of art, now in Australia, by Jordaens. But you will remember, right, from our analysis earlier, that belongs to the added bits. So whoever did those additions didn't really understand the logic of quasi-citation that Vateau was following. Okay, now for the pictorial sleigh ride portion of today's entertainment. I'm going to move into this image because it's a very high quality image that allows me to zoom in on details. So I'm going to try to give you a kind of tour of the painting following a few different lines of analysis. One of the things, can you still hear me? I'm sort of turned in another direction. One of the things that's interesting here is the way the figures in the shop, or in this case entering the shop, resonate with the figures in the paintings. So you'll notice this gentleman here putting out his hand to his partner, and then behind them is a nude figure, maybe Venus, putting out her hand to her partner, maybe Mars. He looks like he's in armor. And then if we move along here, we have this standing woman looking very closely at the foliage in the trees, and then this man leaning, kneeling and leaning on his cane, looking intently at these female nudes. And above him is our Saint Bruno. So Saint Bruno is praying to the broken body of Christ while the connoisseur feasts his eyes on nude flesh. And then here, sorry, I'm not really very good at this, but there it is. We have a mirror being presented to potential purchasers, and you'll notice the profile of St. Catherine here is rhyming with this figure and really with this figure, whom some have identified with Gersaint's wife, Marie-Louise Sirois. So that's one sort of tour one can take through the painting. Another really has to do with this quality it has of being between categories. It's a signboard without really being much like a signboard, and it's a gallery picture that's not quite a gallery picture. It remembers that it's a signboard. Signboards are very aware of the fact that they're on surfaces, they have to fill a certain surface, certain things have to be legible. And I feel that Vateau really respects and responds to this implicit demand of signboards. He's very, very interested, or at least attentive to contingencies on the surface of the picture. So, I mean, they're everywhere. Look at the way this foot just meets the edge of the extension of the sidewalk, or the way his hand just meets the edge of the crate, or the way this hand meets the joining of mirror and picture frame. look at the way this couple, he's reaching out his hand in space to this figure who hasn't even fully entered the shop, but his finger outstretched just touches her sleeve. I don't think it's touching it in space. His toe as well is just contingent with her beautiful robe volante. And then here, it's a cascade of contingencies. Look at that sleeve just grazing on the surface, that wig, or the cane, or that sleeve and this dress, or maybe her finger and her own dress, or her sort of, whatever you want to call it, bonnet, and his wig. And almost like the coup de grace, her very pointy shoe just reaching that actual threshold, that is the threshold of the store. And that raises the question about 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, which is, needless to say, preoccupation of painters always. But I think in this case, given the theme of this painting, it carries, you might say, ideological resonances. The question really is, are these images or are they objects? It's really the question of the painting as a whole, in a way, signboard or painting. On the left, we see 2 pieces of merchandise being moved. One, the painting of Louis XIV, lowered into its crate, and the other, a mirror. And it's a historical fact that Gersaint sold not just paintings, but things like mirrors. And yet, of course, the association between paintings and mirrors is a legendary one. Looking at that shop assistant with his arms outstretched across the mirror, it's hard for me, at least, not to think of Leon Battista Alberti, who in his treatise of 1435 called Narcissus, the first painter. For what else is painting, Alberti, for what else is painting but embracing all that lies on the surface of the water? We barely see a reflection in the mirror, just a little bit. You see the arm and the body, just a little bit. Narcissus, of course, quite to the contrary, famously saw only image, seeing through the surface to another body, or what he thought was another body. And even after he becomes aware that it's a reflection, it's too late, he's already in love. So do you see the image or do you see the medium? Do you see the thingness of the work? Is it a representation or is it an artifact, commodity? The king portrait, you could say, is shown undergoing a change in status, and this is one way of describing it. From being a quasi-magical surrogate of the king's body, standing in for him in important places, it's become an artifact, a framed painting, a work for sale, or rather a work having been sold, a physical thing that needs to be crated up. And let's move now to the next episode of involving pictures. Here, I've pointed out the standing woman using her lorgnette to look at the painting, even though her nose is right into it. She just can't get close enough to the surface. And what she's appreciating is brushwork. She's looking at the leaves on the trees. This is a recent development, this kind of appreciation. The words that they would have used would have been the franchise du pinceau, the masterful freedom of the brush, the coup de maître, master strokes. And that was a bit of an overturning of traditional ways of looking at art. You tended to downplay the handicraft element of art, but here, that's really what's important. And that's an appreciation of the surface. That's an appreciation of the artifact. Now, the man kneels, resting on his cane, and he also brings his face up close. but he's looking at the nude figures. So that puts truly comical pressure on the critical question, is he looking at brushwork or is he looking at flesh? Now, the couple, I see them as really a unit. I'm not quite sure what to make of him. The couple are being presented with a portable mirror, and logically, given the context, they're assessing it as a potential purchase, as an object. And yet they're clearly becoming absorbed by what they see in the mirror. Look at the way the seated lady reaches her head over just enough to be able to see herself in the mirror. You could say they're trying out the mirror. And in trying out, they are, of course, trying themselves out in it. Each person gazing into the mirror sees something different, something of particular interest to them, their own image, and of course, it is an image of themselves in a world, right? It's a strangely fictive, shifting world. They see themselves in a world of paintings and of people looking at paintings, and possibly even mirrors reflecting other paintings and other people. So these objects that they're surrounded by, that they see themselves surrounded by in that mirror, are valuable and interesting and worth investing in, not just for their inherent value, whatever that might be, but because of what they can do for one in this new condition of social mobility. Essentially, they help make self-identification possible, even more fluid in this world. So no wonder they're falling into a kind of reverie. As we've seen, this painting, though site-specific, moved pretty much immediately, from outside to inside, to private collection, to foreign princely collection. And then that princely collection was opened up to the public as a museum eventually. And eventually, in the exhibition era, that's our era, the painting has traveled to different capitals. It made an appearance in New York in 1984. It lives through the world it prophesied. Thank you.